Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Space Cowboy Books Online. I'm your host, Jean-Paul Garnier, and today we are here with horror and fantasy author L.C.Barlow. Lindsay Barlow, who writes under the name L.C. Barlow, is a writer and professor working primarily in the field of speculative fiction. She has an M.A. in English and an M.F.A. in creative writing. She has studied with various writers, including Nancy Holder, Elizabeth Hand, and James Patrick Kelly. Her works have been published in a variety of magazines and journals, and her fiction has reached over 65,000 readers and garnered praise and multiple awards. On Quora, her posts have received over 1.7 million content views. Barlow's horror trilogy, Pivot, Perish, and Peak, were picked up in 2018 by California Cold Blood Books, an imprint of Rare Bird Books. Pivot, which I just finished today, and it was fantastic, was released in October of 2019. Perish was released in October of 2020, and Peak will be released in October of this year. Barlow lives in Dallas, Texas, with her two cats, Smaug and Dusty. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Lindsley, and she's going to read us a section of one of her books, and then we'll move into a Q&A section.
Sure thing. So the selection that I've picked out for the reading is actually the very beginning of Perish. The important things to know at this point are that Jack Harper was raised in what is essentially a cult, although they would not call themselves that because it's a bit presumptuous. And in this cult, the cult leader seems to have these impossible abilities, these magical powers, which she ultimately finds out are coming from a magical being in the basement of the house. And when she pursues this being, it actually gives her the ability to resurrect the dead. So using that ability, she's able to sort of reverse some of the assassinations that she has done, because as an acolyte of Cyrus, that is what he has had her do. And at the end of Pivot, not to give too much away, she has essentially been able to escape Cyrus. So we are picking up right after that with Perish. And we are starting with the first chapter. The fire curled itself around the house like an affectionate beast. From the beast's back, smoke billowed up, glowing near the top of the flames before it rushed into the black night. I stood at a distance watching. The heat pushed at me even from so far away. Luton waited on my left. The grass where he stood greened, the air around him cleared. He wore black sweatpants and a gray sweater that had once been moth-eaten but no longer revealed holes or dust. Through the refreshed cloth, glowing tendrils of orange light about the width of a sword blade spread up over his arms, legs, and torso, curving every which way like a vine. Even when he did not move, the interior brightness shifted as though stoked by his breath, becoming brighter, then softer as the intense light flowed over him in waves. His face shone pale in the night except around his eyes and just below his cheeks, where dark lines swept as though drawn in charcoal. His black hair flowed like weed in a light breeze. His dark lips tensed, rigid as a statue's. Love and relief emanated from him, reminding me of a warm fire on the first cold day and the smell of petrichor, the catalyst of all change. His four brothers, whom I had resurrected, looked just like him. Veins of fire also crossed them and dark lines contoured their skin, but they were not Luton. No others compared, no matter their ethereality. This creature had survived 10 long years in Cyrus's basement. This creature had provided me the ability to resurrect. This creature had deemed me worthy of preternatural power. I owed everything to him. Luton's glance flicked toward me. He smirked as though he read my mind. We shared his smile, warmth building in me. With him, I was home and everything would be all right. He was, after all, the creature that returned people to themselves, returned color to the world, returned life. I blinked, he vanished. No puff of smoke, no whoosh of air, no lightning strike, no thunder roar, he simply disappeared. Only a patch of grass remained, a bit greener where his feet had been. I scanned the forest to my left and the bit of lawn between me and the burning mansion. Nothing, no one. I stood alone. Luton had said before that he needed to leave me. He would return when I learned to stop biting. Above the distant roar of the flames, a strange rustling sound rose from my right. I turned. Two of the many trees that separated the burning mansion from the converted red barn about a quarter of a mile away shook. I walked toward them, hand on the gun in my jacket pocket, suddenly thankful for the cool night air that managed to reach me despite the blaze. The sweet electric air woke me, all the tiny hairs on my skin prickled, and everything flashed vibrantly. I had just seen my father killed, not just killed, but torn apart, particle by Luton, the mysterious being from another world, the creature I set free. The night air and recent demise of my Machiavellian mentor cleared my mind as I fearlessly moved toward whatever creature lurked in the low grass. I reached the tree line. In the twilight was the shape of a white-haired man with long legs. He crawled in the dirt. He wore black pants and shoes, but the majority of his shirt, excluding several dark stains on the fabric, flashed as white as his hair. He glowed in the darkness. Thick, dark liquid that smelled like a mixture of copper and sugar coated half his face. The other half was clean, recognizable. I knew him, Julian. How he'd survived the whole night, the whole ordeal, remained uncertain, but I was happy he had. Yes, I was very, very happy. You're the one who hurt the children, I said. The man stopped, aware of me for the first time. He glanced at me, his face kindled dread, and I reached for my knife, lifted the blade free. A gurgling sound escaped him, and he flung himself down and attempted to crawl away. I stomped one foot firmly on his leg, stopping him, and retrieved my gun. I pointed it at him in the dark. The black metal reflected the red flames. Julian froze. His elbow wobbled, threatening to collapse. He could barely prop himself up. His whole body shook with exhaustion. Why do you do it? He asked. He meant, why had I betrayed my father, let loose the creature in his basement, diverted the children they planned to send out into the world to bomb churches and schools, and squashed Cyrus's evolution? I owed him no answer, and my own aching exhaustion kept me silent. Why do you kill Cyrus? He gave you everything. Jealousy simmered just beneath the accusation. He lay in the dirt, his ribs heaving, his body shaking. One of Cyrus's loyal devotees, he had determinedly worked his way to the top. Julian would have cleaned the underside of Cyrus's shoe with his tongue if Cyrus had asked. He'd played dead time and time again, convincing children they had killed him, that they were unworthy, unclean, and needed Cyrus to lead them. I pictured him on the gurney, fake blood pouring out of him as a young boy stood with a scalpel in his hand, shocked. You are too dark, Cyrus told the boy, pretending the child was responsible for Julian's death. It's a good thing I am here to save you from your darkness. The child, probably 8 years old, nodded, fully believing those words, and a new follower was created. Cyrus and Julian traumatized children in such a way that they no longer trusted themselves. Instead, they trusted Cyrus. I moved my pistol slightly, motioning for Julian to rise. No more screwing with people's heads, I said. The cult is dead. So are you. Julian cocked his head, his chest heaving. How did you do it, and why? We were so close to bringing about Cyrus's transformation. We only needed tonight. I remembered what the Ferrix told me after I had resurrected them, that the box Cyrus used to gain supposed power was a toy through which the builder made murderers out of men. It was how Cyrus made followers out of children, only one step further up the chain. That was a lie, I told him. The box was never going to give him preternatural power. It was suggesting that only to influence him to murder a large number of individuals. No one was going to evolve. There wasn't going to be a revolution. No, Julian yelled, his eyes wide. That's the lie. We owned a box from the builder himself. Cyrus perfected a system for growing it. He fed it pieces of Luton's soul, a Ferrix soul. We were becoming so powerful. Do you know what you've done? You've destroyed one of the most potent and protective systems in the world created by your father. I blinked and took a deep breath. This man would never understand. He destroyed the lives of hundreds of people, of children just like me. You helped him, I said. I glared at Julian. He stared wide-mouthed up at me, as though he couldn't believe that his words didn't convince me. I gestured with the pistol again. Up, it said. The red barn loomed in the distance, the place where they had kept the children. It remained safe from the blaze. When Julian did not rise, I knelt on the grass and leaned toward him. He scrambled back, as though I might eat him. How about, I said kindly, we stop worrying about all that's just happened and do what needs to be done? What's that? Fear rolled off his breath. I want you to show me what's on the left side of the barn. What are you talking about? I smiled. When Cyrus gave me the tour, I didn't get to see the whole place. You think I didn't notice the side door? You're going to open it. Julian shook his head, his gaze dropping to the grass as though his mind refused to entertain the idea. I jammed the back of my left heel straight down on his damaged leg. He screamed. Okay, he shouted. Okay. He grabbed a low branch from one of the trees and hoisted himself semi-upright. He wobbled dangerously and then stabilized. One step at a time, he limped 10 feet in front of me. I followed. In less than 10 minutes, we reached the red barn. The lights inside brightened the path near the entryway. Instead of entering through the front into the cream-colored modern lobby, we angled to the left, away from the lights and the city dark. Behind us, the shimmery light from the burning mansion and the smell of smoke and the cold air seemed dreamlike. Julian glanced back at me once, red light coating the left side of his face, his blue eyes hazy and glazed over. He paused, oddly still, as though he wondered if I were about to shoot him. You're not going to like what you see. We're in a little corner of hell in this world. That's to be expected, I said. I pursed my lips. He stared at me for a few seconds longer and then turned to continue limping forward. As we rounded the building, Julian said, Jack, in a voice so low I almost missed it. You could lead the cult, you know. With the red box, you could do anything. Julian's words barely pierced the ringing in my ears from the explosive night. He struggled through the grass, a trail of blood behind his right foot. He didn't yet realize how much Luton, his brothers, and I had destroyed. Nothing remained anywhere. The red box is gone, I replied matter-of-factly. He stopped. Behind him, I couldn't see his face or his reaction, but he slumped, wilting, like a flower in a sudden freeze. His thing, whatever it is, a cult following, is dead. It's gone. He turned and looked at me with tears in his eyes. That shocked me, and the tip of my pistol dropped a millimeter. I corrected it. The builder help us all, he whispered. His steps slow, his shoulders drooping, as though expecting death, Julian continued. Along the side of the barn, 2 doors faced us, a weathered gold padlock securing them together. Julian leaned an arm against one door. From his pocket, he retrieved a set of keys. He ran his finger through them and located a gold key. He inserted it into the padlock, turned it, and tugged. I stepped back and readied my weapon. An Arkham might be inside, perhaps in the shape of a blue box this time that would release white smoke and devour our souls. Think of you out in the world, Julian said, his gray blue eyes lifting to meet mine. Think of all the people you will kill, all the lives you will ruin. It will be unleashing chaos in the world. The best place for you, Jack, was here and following with Cyrus. Out there, you'll self-destruct or you'll kill them all. You were built to. Wrong audience, I said, tired of him. Only poison left his lips. Open the doors. He merely stood there blocking my way, my view. Before I could say anything more, he lifted the padlock away and opened the left door and then the right. The black interior obscured everything. I scanned the void wildly, waiting for something to jump out. Julian slid his hand just inside the door. I cocked my pistol and aimed, certain he found a weapon. Something clicked. Brilliant light illuminated the room. Releasing a pent-up breath, I loosened the grip. On the pistol, I forgot Julian. A giant mound of toys rose to 3 times my height. Maybe 100 teddy bears, twice that many Barbie dolls, yellow plastic trucks, cans of Play-Doh, pink necklaces, ponies, dolls, stuffed animals of every kind piled like the greatest Christmas gift a child could ask for. Shiny purple, green, and pink bracelets littered the floor. What the hell is this? Before Julian answered, it came to me. This playroom bounty belonged to the children they had stolen. My back stiffened and my grip tightened dangerously on the pistol still pointed at him. I scanned and rescanned the pile of toys before I studied the room surrounding them. To my left, a table supported a pile of papers. One eye on Julian, I walked forward into the barn, stepped over several wooden letter blocks and arrived at the table. Stacks of identical sheets of paper littered its surface. I lifted one from the top. A figure 8 symbol in bright heavenly blue lay on its side like a toppled hourglass. Over the figure 8, 2 lines came to a point so that the whole thing looked like a triangle or pyramid. The word infinitum floated within. Below the figure 8, the print read, down on your luck, nowhere to go, don't know what the point is anymore, we are here for you. Below this in smaller print, come join us in Basile, Louisiana. I turned to Julian and held up the page. What is this? He looked from the sheet of paper to me with no expression. It's us, Jack. My eyes flicked to the page. Cyrus had never mentioned the word infinitum to me before. Queasy fear of the foreign and unknown washed over me. Us? Julian nodded once. Those are what we distribute. We're what we distributed to people to get them to join. These movements don't just build themselves. As I stared at the page in my hand, the reality of Cyrus's death hit me hard. I had assumed that when he died, the unrelenting and unwieldy feel of life would disappear. Instead, it worsened. The contours of my ignorance ran deep. Infinitum, I said, testing the word in my mouth. Infinitum following, infinitum cult. I'd never seen those words before, but I had never been on the outside. I'd only been on the inside. I swallowed and my throat clicked uncomfortably. Out of the corner of my eye, a flash of movement registered. My head jerked and I pulled the trigger. Wood fragments exploded out of the wall exactly in the place where Julian had been before he bolted. I rushed out into the night. As I rounded the corner of the barn, he appeared in the distance, his white hair shining in the moonlight. I crouched low, readied my pistol, and took a steadying breath. In the distance, a wail rose. My head swiveled, my jaw dropped. Had I mistaken it? No. A high-pitched sound that shifted low, then back like it was traveling round and round, wailed, unraveling, speeding up and slowing down. Police. My senses keen, my body reacted before any thought arrived. I stopped bothering with Julian and ran. I leapt to my feet, racing over the grass back toward the burning mansion, straight to the garage. The sirens pulsed louder, blue and red lights shone in the distance against the tall trees. I jumped into Cyrus's car and jammed the key into the ignition. The Lexus hummed soothingly. I shoved the stick into reverse and slammed out of the drive, the gravel crunching violently under the tires. I sent one more look toward the ever brighter house engulfed in flames, saw the red and blue police lights cresting the hill, and sped away. I drove the opposite direction of the sirens, keeping my headlights off. My heart pounded violently. The light of the full moon barely illuminated the road's lines. I drove on the edge of my seat, glancing in the rearview mirror for any sign of the police chasing me. No one and nothing followed. After several minutes, I released a heavy breath and slowed my speed. I turned my headlights on. Light flooded the road and something flashed into view. I slammed on the brakes and swerved to the right. A nauseating crunch erupted as a car clipped something. A large gray object flew up and forward. The Lexus screeched toward the side of the road, the headlights spotlighting a set of trees. The vehicle came to a stop 5 feet before I would have hit them. What the hell was that?
Thank you, Lindsay. That was from Perish, Book 2 in the Jack Harper series, with a follow-up to Pivot. And we're going to talk a little bit about the first book, since I just finished reading that, but also about the rest of the series. So I wondered, Lindsay, if you could tell us a bit about the inception of the Jack Harper series and about your path towards publication for the trilogy.
Sure thing. So weirdly enough, I guess the inspiration for this trilogy was actually something that happened in high school. At that time, I had a friend who was a Lutheran, and her church supposedly had an ex-Satanist coming to speak to them. And I was, at that time, also interested in dark and gothic things. So she said, why not come and join and see this ex-Satanist come and speak? So I actually went to it. And now I don't think that this woman was an ex-Satanist. I actually kind of think this was almost a scared straight sort of event. But her story was really intriguing to me, and it stuck with me long enough for me to think about it for at least 10 years or so before I started writing. And then after that, once I started writing, the story it really just shifted a lot and changed a lot. So I think that was the spark, but it certainly didn't end up determining a lot of the story. In terms of publication, when I first started writing the trilogy, I had looked up advice on publishing, and a lot of the advice that I read actually was kind of negative. It was sort of like, shouldn't even try to get an agent. It's not possible. It's not possible to get fiction published anymore. In fact, if you want to get published, you should write nonfiction because that's what sells. And so I kind of went into it, kind of down, and I thought, well, I really just have to write this story. It's been with me for 10 years. So I want to write it. And I did write it. And without really reading through it or revising it or anything, I just put it up without querying anybody. I put it up and self-published it on Amazon and various other places. And I made it free. And there are a lot of different things that sort of went into the path from there. One of the things is that I had actually read about Hugh Howey. I don't know if you're really aware of Hugh Howey, but he wrote the Wool trilogy. And which is a sci-fi trilogy, he went into it, into self-publishing, hoping that the feedback that he gained from an audience would help him revise his story. And that's what he did. He wrote, like, I think 5 or 6 different versions of Wool. And he was able to get a lot of audience interest in that. And that's what I was sort of hoping for, I think, when I self-published, without revising, without reading through it, doing all the things that everybody advises you not to do. But in contrast to Howie's experience, that was not mine. So I did not have a lot of feedback. I did not have a lot of tips or recommendations. However, people did complain about the cover. So I actually sought down Bookfly Design, and I talked with them, and they actually created a much better cover for my book. But they themselves said, why not, you know, apply for book awards for this book? And I hadn't even heard of indie awards. I wasn't really aware of them. And then I was like, okay, well, why not? Well, so I submitted it to multiple awards, and I also ended up recommending it for the Bram Stoker Awards. This was back in 2013, I believe. And I also, and this ended up being really important, I got a BookBub ad for Christmas Day 2013. With that BookBub ad, I actually had about 35,000 downloads of the book within those 3 days, which was quite a bit, I would later find out. But in addition, Pivot was on the preliminary ballot for the Bram Stoker Awards in 2013. And so I actually did not know a lot about the World Horror Convention or anything. So, you know, I booked a trip to Portland, Oregon in 2014 to go visit for the very first time. And one of the very first people that I met was actually Jack Ketchum. That's his pen name. His name is Dallas Mayer, and he has unfortunately passed away. But he was there. Gardner Goldsmith was there, and he bought us a couple of drinks, and we got to talking, and I let him know about my book. And I'm guessing he's the one that ended up telling somebody, because I ended up running into a lawyer at that convention who seemed to know that I had been to Germany recently, because I had been to Germany, and he asked me to send him my book. So that night, I actually, you know, I got online and I was like, I shipped one to him, and he ended up reading it, and he was like, you know, I kind of want to get someone else in on this. So he brought in a great guy named Ryan, who is a manager. And they read the book and they were like, this needs a lot of work. And I was like, yes, and I'm willing to do a lot of work. And so they gave me notes with the hopes that I would be able to land an agent. So I took those notes, and I mean, I put my nose to the grindstone, and I worked hard on them. And they said, on average, with a book, you've got about 3 revisions that you need to do before an agent, 3 revisions with an agent, and then 3 revisions with a publisher. They were like, your book needs about 4 revisions. And I was like, that's okay, I'm willing to do it. And I got it done in about 2 revisions. Actually, the book is very, very different. In addition, it originally started out where Pivot and Perish were kind of intertwined. Each chapter went back and forth between past and present. And anyways, I just wrote and wrote and wrote. I wrote about 1,000 pages, single-spaced, to produce a much better version of Pivot. And the reason for that is that I was still working through trial and error, and I had not refined my plotting techniques. We'll put it that way. But in any case, you know, they were like, okay, we can send this off. And they sent it off to what amount ultimately was 4 agents. The first agent took about 3 months to read it. It was in a slush pile, basically. And her thing was that she only represented horror that was more literary. and not so paranormal or supernatural. But she liked it a lot, and she recommended it to an agent that she knew, and that agent read it within 24 hours, and that's the difference between the slush pile and a recommendation. And she said, I actually, I represent dark fantasy. So I'm going to pass on this. And she asked if I had anything else. And she said she might be interested in representing that. And I was like, I really kind of want to pursue this. So we left off. It went to a third agent, which it wasn't really in his line of things. And then finally I landed with Jonathan Lyons. And I worked with him. And he recommended that I split the book into 2 books. And I actually said I didn't want to do that because I had already spent so much time honing this book down into this nice little gem that the idea of getting it again was tough, right? And so I said no. He sent it off to publishers, and all the publishers' responses were, you need to split the books. So I ended up splitting the books, and submissions went out again. And fortunately, the trilogy landed with California Cold Blood Books, an imprint of Rarebird Books, and the publisher is Bob Peterson. So I was very, very fortunate.
It's amazing the process we have to go through to get books out there sometimes. I wanted to ask about something about pivot, and I'm sure that follows in the rest of the series as well. The first book in the series, it deals a lot with manipulation, tactics of manipulation, and evil in general. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your personal thoughts on these concepts and what draws you to write about them.
That's a really good question. So what I will say is that personally, before I pursued creative writing as intensely as I do now, my first MA was in English, and my focus was rhetoric and psychoanalytic theory. And a lot of that work is unpacking the arguments that are being made overtly or otherwise. And I think that's just something I really enjoy and love. I love analyzing argument. I love working with students, because I'm a professor. I love working with students and showing them the sort of subtle and complex messages that can be beneath the top layer of things. And so I probably am interested in that, but then also the psychoanalytic theory, Lacanian psychoanalysis, which a lot of people dislike. I find it really intriguing. And so my question is like, what builds this character? What's the higher truth of this character, or what's the decided truth of this character, I guess. And manipulation probably also plays quite a bit into that. A lot of the stuff that that is in Pivot, which how do you build an assassin versus how do you build a follower, and how does that look different? That kind of came out in the writing itself. And Cyrus, his manipulation came out in the writing itself. I would say, like, I never had trouble writing him. I never had trouble finding something for him to do. The only thing that my agent had me bring out was his charisma a bit more, because even though I could see the character, I hadn't really brought that out. So I did have to bring that sort of loving aspect out. But also I will add that I wanted to make sure that, just like with Cyrus, where you have that manipulation and then you have that almost loving aspect, but that's also like really prevalent in the books. So you have those really negative aspects in the book where the reader feels kind of like they're being ground down between a mortar and pestle. And then you also have the moments of awe. And you kind of have a little bit of salty, a little bit of sweet. And that, I think, is sort of the basis for manipulation, right? As Cyrus says, you provide the wounds and the salve. So I tried to make sure that both were really present in the book, if that makes sense.
And you did something interesting in book one, where the first half of the book is written from a child's perspective, and then later in the book from a teenager's perspective. I wanted to ask you what made you decide to write from the perspective of a child and then teen, especially in contrast to such a gruesome novel.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing that I will say is that when I did start out with Pivot, I did not actually intend for Jack to remain a child so long. So in Paris, she is an adult, essentially a young adult by that point. And I had that book going back and forth. It's just that when I split them and I started elongating these, it's sort of like the childhood gets elongated, right? And so does the adulthood. But at the same time, I will say that with Jack, I was trying to create a character that's lost before she knows what being lost is, right? It's sort of one of those characters where, age of 6, someone has you kill somebody, you don't know what that is. And so I don't know how a different way to build that up than from starting from that moment, right? I guess you could have a flashback to that moment, but that would not resonate, and I don't think it would feel as genuine. And since the book, the trilogy, is about Jack's transformation, how even though she is lost without knowing what lost is, she nevertheless has an identity somehow outside of what Cyrus created and is able to latch onto that and build on it. And so I would say, obviously, the books are not for children, but just because that a lot of that is happening with her as a child, I think is not just to be shocking, but it's to fully build that character.
And following on that, much of the horror in horror novels often tends to take place off of the page. As a horror author, how do you go about directing the reader's imagination towards these unseen, off-the-page aspects of the story?
Yeah, that's a really intriguing question. And it actually makes me think of a Buffy the Vampire Slayer episode, which I watched that so many years ago. But there was one episode where it turns out that this man who's dating her mother is actually, I think he's an AI or a robot of some sort. And they suspect something's wrong with him because he's been abusive towards Buffy. I think he throws her down the stairs or something. In any case, the gang get together and they go to his apartment to sort of snoop around. And all you see is they find, I think, a secret little lair. Xander opens a closet door and closes it and says, "Let's go." And they say, "Well, what was in it?" And he says, "His other wives," or something like that. That's all you get. And I think there's enough detail there for the audience to picture what has happened to these women without it ever being shown, right? And so I think if you are going to eliminate scenes, eliminate giving it directly to the audience, then the structure itself needs to be where the audience can extrapolate that automatically. And then also there's enough detail there for the audience to create that story in their own minds. So another example would be in The Shining, when they're going through all the food, right? That's in the kitchen. You're given the ability to imagine what a Thanksgiving would look like at that hotel without the Thanksgiving ever having taken place, right? And that's kind of similar to, say, you have a character goes down into a basement, sees a weapon there of some sort, chainsaw, knife, or something. There's something on it, might be red, might be blood. You just give them enough clues, and then the audience themselves is able to piece it together. But that structure has to be there, and the details have to be there for that to take place. But that is in my opinion, that is what horror is supposed to do. When I originally started out not knowing what I was doing, I always assumed that horror was in the scene itself. It's just in that particular scene. And the more lurid that scene is, the better. But in reality, it's almost like packing it on unnecessarily. And it's almost like an actor who is trying to play a villain and he's like twisting his mustache, right? It's just a little too heavy. One particular scene cannot carry that, right? So it has to be in the structure, it has to be in the detail. And you do have to set up the rules for the audience to be able to play them out in their own minds without you necessarily having to handhold them, I guess.
We've got an audience question here. How do you get into a writerly headspace? Do you listen to music before you write, or do you have any kind of pre-writing rituals? Or do you just sit down and let the language flow?
I would say I've done all of those. If I'm not on a tight schedule, I'll maybe think about it while I'm doing the dishes. Whenever I would commute a lot, I would listen to music and sort of imagine things, try to build things up in my head. That was really helpful for me. Lighting a candle while I'm working and drinking coffee or something, that's really helpful. That being said, sometimes the revisions that are required, they're more technical than creative. And so I don't need to get into that sort of headspace. And it's really more about just putting in the hours and getting the work done. So in that case, I tend to say 3 hours every day, hell or high water until it's done. And that's what I do. So, but I mean, lots of writers have their little quirks, little things that they do, like lighting candles or, doing this particular thing or going for a run or something. There's a joke that your grout is never cleaner than when you have to write something. And it's because I think you tend to want to put down physical order to a place before you start putting down mental order. And so it's sort of like just getting it right? The whole thing is about getting it right.
I also wanted to ask about your main character, Jack. Jack's female, but we don't find that out until about halfway through book one, or I hadn't quite put it together yet. What made you decide to deal with gender in this ambiguous way during book one?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. When I first self-published the book, I actually never stated that Jack was female until the very, very end. And I think the response that I got from the professionals that I worked with was that, like, this is not necessary. It's not necessary to obscure. So actually, I continued on writing without attempting to obscure the gender. And originally, the one flashback that's in Pivot, which is where she's eating the berries. So Cyrus is doing a sort of Russian roulette with berries to determine the outcome of something. That was in the beginning of the book. It wasn't yet a flashback. And so I had said she was wearing a dress. So it's simply because that scene got moved and I hadn't given any other indication. I think that it feels delayed. That being said, I did not go out of my way to give her a feminine identity, and I very much view the character as almost genderless. Her identity is a violent identity, and that is all. There is no room for anything else. And so she only knows essentially what she's been told to be, if that makes sense.
So, more generally speaking, what you write in both the genres of horror and dark fantasy. What attracted you to writing in these genres in the first place, and do you ever write in any other genres? You said you primarily focus on speculative fiction. Do we ever get any science fiction from you, or magical realism, so forth?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I did grow up reading Stephen King and Anne Rice, so perhaps it was inevitable. But I will say, when I was at Texas A&M, I accidentally took a how to write horror course. It was not labeled as that, and every single person who signed up for the course did not know that it was horror oriented. But that being said, I took to it, and I was able to write far more for that course, and far more creatively, I felt, for that course than in any of my other courses. And once that happened, I really didn't move away from it. It also fit quite well with, again, I had that idea from seeing the ex-Satanist speak of kind of playing with this idea. So I think that all just sort of fit together really, really well. That being said, I have written things that are not horror or dark fantasy. Not so much now. I mean, the book that I'm working on beyond the trilogy is dark fantasy with a tiny bit of sci-fi. But I'm not averse to those things. I think I've just been working in this particular genre for a while. I will also say that writing in an entirely new genre is sometimes like learning how to walk again. It is not like once you have horror down, you can now go write romance or something. So it is sort of like starting anew, which I'm fine with. But I don't know that I would ultimately find a brand new genre and just stick with it. I might be dark fantasy, horror, and a little bit of sci-fi.
I also wanted to ask about a certain group in the books, the Ferrics, which are sort of, my take, somewhere between an angel and a demon, or blur the lines of those things. Ferric to me suggests iron, ferrous material. And I wanted to ask you what made you make this decision, and what is the connection there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think probably I liked the just the sound of the word ferric, but also they've got these red lines throughout their bodies, which kind of makes me think of Ferris, right, with that kind of rusty look. But they literally came out in the writing itself. So originally I had put far too many of the explanations for things that are happening on the Roland character. And until I built that Luton character up, the creature in the basement that can explain a lot of these things, the Roland character kind of had too much going on. But once the Ferrics came out, and I think your description of them being halfway between a demon and an angel is actually probably spot on. I don't know, they just sort of expanded, and certainly by the third book, I mean, the third book is truly entering their world a little bit. But I did not plan them out. I mean, all of Luton's lines were created on the spot while I was writing. I didn't foresee any of the group, which it's always nice when you're surprised by your own writing. But that was the case for me.
And I wanted to ask about the creation and inspiration of some of your characters, particularly in book one, the character of Cyrus, who's basically on a mission of pure evil, with no reason for it other than evil itself. So what went into the creation of this character, and what was the inspiration? You mentioned the ex-Satanist talk you went to, but also beyond that, and because he's a very fully actualized character.
Yeah, great question. I think he succeeds in a way that no cult leader does. He is the cult leader that he's the apex, right? And it's funny, I always knew that he was going to be there, and like I said, when I was writing, I never had a shortage of things for him to do. He just kind of came naturally, maniacal, manipulative, conniving, truly horrible. And I mean, maybe it probably sounds bad that it just came so naturally to me, but it did. And I had a reader who described him as halfway between Manson and Lucifer from Supernatural. Charles Manson, Lucifer from Supernatural. And I think that's actually pretty accurate. I think it is. But yes, he is quite fully realized, and it may be just the number of words that I spent on trying to figure out what this character is, what his motivations are. And certainly by the end of the book, I had to sort of dig down and say, okay, you know, literally, why is he doing these things? And I came up with a pretty, I feel like, good reasoning for why evil happens, for why he pursues these evil things. And so, yeah, I cannot say what inspired him. I did want to write, you know, a cult leader who can do all of the things that he says he's doing, who can bring people back from the dead, who can heal people from, say, cancer, who can do all of these things, all that everybody else claims to, and sort of see where that leads if he's not a failure.
I feel like with that character, you really nailed the charm of the psychopath. Psychopaths often are very charismatic and charming, and use that to draw people in. And in Cyrus's character, I feel like you really did that well. And as evil as he was, I don't want to give any spoilers. I was kind of sad to see him go. You also work as a college professor in English. How has teaching changed the art of writing for you?
Ooh, it's a good question. I don't know. Well, so the thing is that teaching my students, I teach English 1301 and 1302. I have done creative writing seminars, and that's been interesting as well. I will say that teaching 1301 and 1302 is more teaching academic writing. And so the rules are going to be different. The expectations are going to be different. A lot of my students don't tend to write creatively. And that's okay. I will say that for the seminars that I've done, it's been interesting to, so for instance, one of the major things that I like to bring to the table is something that Nancy Holder brought to me, which is Save the Cat by Blake Snyder and The Writer's Journey by Christopher Vogler. Both of these craft books have beat sheets in them. And their argument is that basically all Western stories, at least, follow these beats. And I mean, it's not everybody agrees, right? But I do find them to be really useful. And so in my seminars for creative writing, I'll oftentimes present these beats so that at least the audience knows about them. And then I'll go into detail about one of those beats or one of those characters, and I'll have them do 15 minutes of writing. And then whoever can share, can share. But something, let me think, that my students have given me probably, maybe it's being surprised at how creative they are even when they're not seeking creative writing. So if I give them a sort of writing exercise, they can come up with things that just blow me away. And I suspect that a lot of them don't pursue writing simply because it's not guaranteed money, if that makes sense. So they're really going for something that's guaranteed, something, you know, usually STEM oriented. But when they sit down and they write, and some of them are better writers sometimes than I was, you know, at that age, and I'm just shocked. And I make sure that they know it. But I also try to encourage them to consider pursuing writing. I myself did not start out in writing. I started out in biomedical science, and I did that for a year and a half before I decided it was not for me. Anything with blood is not for me, oddly enough. But I guess maybe having patience with people who are still finding their own way, and may end up circling back to writing later on. I think that that might be something that they've given me.
That's interesting that you have issues with blood because there's so much in the books.
Yeah, I thought I might be a doctor at one point, and I volunteered in an emergency room for about a month, and no, nope.
So book 3 of the Jack Harper series is coming out this October. But what is next for you after the completion of the Jack Harper trilogy? What current projects are you working on, and what's next for you in general?
So recently, just like a week or two, actually, my agent got back with me about a manuscript I had submitted for, I think right now I'm calling it Sweet Holy Phantom, which is a dark fantasy novel about a clairvoyant society that has to dose with a drug in order to keep their sort of traumatic visions at bay. And there's one particular character who the drug doesn't work on her. And she's kind of slowly losing her mind. But at the same time, she's able to notice groups of people that live that none of the other society can see. So it's sort of like a world within a world. And it's because these beings exist outside of time that none of the other seers can see them. So fortunately, my agent got back with me about it, and he had just a few notes for me. So I'm going to be revising that and sending it back to him. So I'm hopeful, it will eventually be sent out to publishers. And I intend that to be a duology. So, hopefully it'll be sent out, and then if someone picks it up, they'll also want the second book. So that's what I'm working on right now. And then I have a short story that is definitely more sci-fi. It's funny because you asked that question. It's definitely probably purely sci-fi that I would like to expand into at least a novella length work.
Well, if that comes to fruition, please be in touch, because we usually have sci-fi events, but of course we love all things speculative fiction. So, Lindsay, I want to thank you for sharing your work and your thoughts with us this evening. I'd like to thank our audience. Book 1, Pivot, is out, and Book 2, Perish. You can find these both at our online store. If you're interested in getting them, please get in touch. And with any luck, maybe we can even get Lindsay to sign a book plate for you.
Oh, of course.
In the meantime, thank you everybody for coming. And Lindsay, if you have any parting thoughts before we go.
Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you for having me on, John Paul.